Imagine a war where your enemy's bullets and your nation's bullets came from the same factory. A war where a corporation's boardroom made decisions that helped both sides stay armed and working. Where profit and patriotism blurred, and loyalty meant something entirely different than you expect. During World War II, the greatest conflict in human history, nations fought for survival. But behind the front lines, another war was being waged, the war of commerce, industry, and global enterprise. In this hidden world, American corporations established factories and subsidiaries in Germany. They exported parts, materials, and machine tools. They provided technology and know-how. Yet, when the war turned, they rapidly pivoted to supplying the Allied war effort with the engines of victory. How could the same company sit on both sides of the fence? How could boardrooms hundreds of miles away decide who got built, who ordered tanks, who got trucks, and who got punch-card machines to track humanity itself? Tonight, we pull back the curtain and expose the thousands of pages of corporate memos, trade licenses, export ledgers, and wartime regulation that show the war wasn't fought only in trenches and skies, it was fought in offices and factories. Welcome to American corporations that secretly funded both sides. Stay with us for the next 2 hours as we uncover the deals behind the deals, and the consequences when profit meets warfare. The Second World War is remembered as the deadliest conflict in human history, a war of nations, ideologies, and armies. But behind the battlefields, beyond the generals and flags, a different kind of war was taking place, one fought not with bullets, but with contracts, money, and silent handshakes across oceans. It was a war of business, where the world's most powerful corporations stood in the shadows of governments, fueling machines of death on both sides, while counting profits in the language of dollars. In the 1930s, the United States was still recovering from the Great Depression. Factories were closing, workers were starving, and banks were collapsing. But across the Atlantic, a new kind of industrial miracle was rising: the Third Reich. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, had transformed itself into a fortress of productivity. Its highways, factories, and military industries were booming. For American businessmen watching from afar, Nazi Germany wasn't just a dictatorship, it was a potential gold mine. Trade between the two nations was supposed to be limited by neutrality laws, but the truth was far more complex. Before the war, major American corporations had already invested deeply in Europe. Some had built subsidiaries in Germany during the 1920s. Others had made secret licensing deals with German industrial giants. As Hitler's armies marched and conquered, those connections only grew stronger, carefully hidden behind layers of front companies and diplomatic loopholes. Among those corporations were names that even today define American industry: Ford, General Motors, Standard Oil, IBM, Eastman Kodak, Coca-Cola. To the public, they were symbols of innovation, prosperity, and freedom. But behind the scenes, many of them had woven a global web of production and finance that made them indispensable to both Allied and Axis powers. The question history rarely dares to ask is this: how could the same corporations that supplied tanks, trucks, and weapons to the Allied forces also be tied to companies that powered Hitler's war machine? The answer lies in the moral gray zone where patriotism ends and profit begins. It all started in the aftermath of the First World War. America had emerged as the industrial engine of the world, producing cars, chemicals, and machinery on a scale no other nation could match. American companies began spreading across the globe, establishing subsidiaries from London to Berlin. At first, these were innocent expansions of commerce. But when Germany fell into political chaos and the Nazis rose to power in 1933, those same businesses saw opportunity, not danger. Germany's rearmament program, the largest industrial mobilization since the dawn of the century, needed machinery, engines, oil, and technology. American corporations had what Hitler needed: And Hitler had what those corporations wanted: contracts, raw materials, and cheap labor. Through a mix of direct investment, secret licensing, and clever legal structures, the two sides found each other and built one of the most disturbing alliances in economic history. Ford Motor Company had already built its German branch, Ford Work, long before the war began. General Motors had purchased Opel, one of Germany's largest car manufacturers. Standard Oil, working closely with German chemical conglomerate IG Farben, shared patents and fuel technologies essential for the production of synthetic oil, the lifeblood of the German Luftwaffe. IBM German subsidiary, Die Hamag, provided the punch: card machines that allowed Nazi bureaucrats to catalog populations, including the identification of Jews across occupied Europe. And it, a powerful telecommunications giant, quietly owned shares in Focke-Wulf, a German aircraft manufacturer producing warplanes for Hitler's Air Force. Every one of these connections was wrapped in legal justification, hidden behind the language of commerce. "We're just doing business," they claimed. "These are independent subsidiaries," they said, but the deeper one looks, the more the illusion crumbles. The truth was that even as Europe burned, the machinery of American capitalism kept turning, and it didn't stop at borders or morality. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, American business leaders watched with concern, but also with calculation. War, after all, meant demand. Demand for fuel, for engines, for steel. Even as American newspapers condemned Hitler's aggression, certain corporations continued to maintain quiet communication with their German partners, using neutral countries like Switzerland and Sweden as intermediaries. Bank transfers flowed through the shadows, materials were rerouted, and profits, vast and growing, were carefully recorded. This wasn't simply greed. It was the belief that business should stand above politics, that markets were eternal even when nations went to war. But in practice, that ideology became a shield for something darker. It meant that while American soldiers would one day fight and die on foreign soil, some of the bombs and vehicles they faced might have been built with American parts or powered by fuel refined from American patents. And as the 1940s dawned, the shadow of war grew larger. Germany's invasion of France and the bombing of Britain made it clear that Hitler was no passing storm. The world was on the brink of catastrophe. Yet, inside boardrooms in New York, Detroit, and Pittsburgh, the gears of industry kept moving methodically, profitably, and silently. The world would soon discover that when the smoke cleared and the battlefields fell silent, the winners of the war weren't only nations. They were corporations, companies that had played both sides, survived the carnage, and emerged richer than ever. Henry Ford was one of the most celebrated industrialists of the 20th century, a man who revolutionized manufacturing and turned the automobile into an everyday symbol of freedom. But behind his public image as a mechanical genius lay a man whose ideology and business decisions cast a long, controversial shadow. Ford's connection with Germany began long before the rise of the Third Reich. In the 1920s, he had established a successful German branch, Ford Work AG, in the city of Cologne. It was a smart business move. Germany was Europe's largest car market at the time, but it would soon tie the Ford empire to one of history's darkest regimes. Henry Ford's personal views only made matters more disturbing. He was openly anti-Semitic, publishing a series of essays that spread hateful conspiracies about Jewish people. Those writings were later translated and distributed in Germany, where they caught the attention of Adolf Hitler himself. In 1931, Hitler told a journalist that he regarded Henry Ford as an inspiration, even keeping a portrait of him in his Munich office. By the time the Nazis came to power in 1933, Ford Work was already deeply entrenched in the German economy. When Germany began its massive rearmament, Ford's factories in Cologne became essential to the Nazi war machine. They produced trucks and engines that moved soldiers, carried supplies, and transported weapons to the front lines. Ford's American headquarters publicly denied any involvement in German production after the outbreak of war, insisting that the subsidiary operated independently under German control. But records later showed that Ford's management maintained communication with the Cologne branch well into the late 1930s. The profits from Ford work continued to appear on the company's balance sheets even as Germany prepared for invasion. The reality on the ground was brutal. As the war escalated, Ford work relied on forced labor, including prisoners of war and civilians captured from occupied territories. Behind the factory gates, men and women were worked to exhaustion under harsh conditions, all to build vehicles for the Reich. Yet across the ocean, the Ford Motor Company was simultaneously building trucks and aircraft engines for the United States military. The same engineering genius that powered Hitler's army also powered the Allied advance in Europe. It was a paradox that history could barely comprehend an empire that profited from both sides of the war it helped to supply. General Motors followed a similar path. In 1929, GM had purchased Opel, Germany's largest automobile manufacturer. At first, it was a purely economic move. Opel was an established brand with a loyal market. But when the Nazis took power, Opel's factories became vital to Germany's rearmament efforts. They produced military trucks, aircraft engines, and even armored vehicles used by the Wehrmacht. Like Ford, GM claimed that once war began, they lost control of their German operations. Yet internal correspondence from before 1941 tells a different story, one of close cooperation, shared patents, and mutual profit. In 1938, GM top executives attended an auto show in Berlin where Nazi officials praised the company's contribution to the national cause. Opel's production was booming, and its profits were flowing back to American shareholders. Even as Hitler annexed Austria and invaded Czechoslovakia, GM continued to operate in Germany, carefully maintaining its position through Swiss and Dutch intermediaries. Neutrality laws in the U.S. were used as a shield, allowing corporate leaders to argue that business was business even when that business was building machines for an army preparing to conquer Europe. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, everything changed, at least on the surface. GM factories in America were immediately converted into massive centers for Allied war production. They built tanks, aircraft engines, and vehicles for the U.S. Army, earning patriotic praise from the government. But behind the patriotic facade, their German subsidiary continued operations under Nazi control. Opel kept manufacturing military trucks and engines for the Wehrmacht throughout the war. After 1945, GM would receive compensation from the U.S. government for damages to its German property caused by Allied bombing, effectively getting paid for factories that had served the enemy. The duality was staggering. On one side, GM executives accepted medals for their contribution to America's victory. On the other, they quietly collected payments for assets that had fueled Hitler's war. Ford and GM together demonstrated how deeply profit could override ideology. Both companies claimed innocence, insisting their German branches acted independently. Yet the records, correspondence, and balance sheets tell a darker truth. Even as soldiers died in battlefields, the gears of industry turned without loyalty to any flag. The moral consequences of these actions were almost never addressed. In post-war America, the corporations that supplied both sides faced little scrutiny. The media, eager to celebrate victory, rarely spoke of the tangled web that had connected Wall Street to Berlin. And in the newly emerging Cold War, when West Germany became an ally against the Soviet Union, no one wanted to reopen the wounds of corporate collaboration. The story was quietly buried under decades of silence. But history has a way of remembering. When researchers began uncovering the connections between American corporations and Nazi Germany in the 1970s and 1980s, the revelations were shocking. Declassified documents showed that profits from German subsidiaries were carefully monitored and, in some cases, transferred through neutral banks even during wartime. These were not simple accidents of global business, they were calculated strategies to preserve assets, to survive any outcome, and to ensure that no matter who won the war, the corporations would emerge stronger than before. The truth was simple, yet horrifying. While nations fought for survival, multinational corporations fought for dominance. They were the invisible empire behind the war, one that could fund both sides, hedge every risk, and rise above every catastrophe. If Ford and General Motors powered the war with engines and steel, then Standard Oil fueled it literally. No army, no navy, no air force could move without oil. It was the black lifeblood of modern warfare, and during World War II, one company sat at the center of it all. Standard Oil of New Jersey, known today as ExxonMobil, was one of the most powerful corporations in the world. By the 1930s, its reach stretched across continents, with deep connections to chemical industries in both America and Europe. One of its closest partners was the German industrial giant IG Farben, the same conglomerate that would later produce the Zyklon B gas used in Nazi death camps. Together, Standard Oil and IG Farben had built a vast global network of chemical patents, synthetic fuel technologies, and production plants that would become indispensable to both the Allies and the Axis. At the time, Germany lacked sufficient natural oil reserves to sustain a prolonged war. The Nazis needed synthetic fuel, artificial gasoline made from coal through chemical conversion. The technology that made this possible had been developed years earlier through collaboration between Standard Oil and IG Farben. Patent exchanges and joint ventures allowed Germany to refine synthetic oil at an industrial scale. In return, Standard Oil received access to advanced chemical processes and new markets abroad. When Hitler began his conquests, Germany's tanks, trucks, and aircraft depended on that synthetic fuel. Without it, the Blitzkrieg might have stalled before it began. And though America would eventually enter the war against Germany, the groundwork for this fuel revolution had already been laid with American assistance. As tensions in Europe grew, Standard Oil publicly distanced itself from Germany. But behind closed doors, its executives continued negotiating patent rights and supply agreements through neutral countries like Switzerland and Spain. When war broke out in 1939, reports emerged that German U-boats were using additives derived from American patents. American refineries had supplied the technology. The oil had become a weapon, one that burned in the engines of both sides. Even after the United States entered the war, the legacy of those early collaborations haunted the battlefield. Allied investigators later discovered that Standard Oil had delayed sharing certain fuel technologies with the U.S. military technologies that could have improved aviation performance because they were bound by their agreements with IG Farben. In the fog of war, legal contracts had become barriers to national security. Corporate loyalty was stronger than patriotism, but oil was only one part of the story. If Standard Oil fueled the war, IBM organized it. In the 1930s, the International Business Machines Corporation was the pride of American innovation, a company that symbolized the future of data and automation. Its founder, Thomas J. Watson, envisioned a world where machines could tabulate information faster than any human clerk. That dream found a dark reflection in Nazi Germany. IBM German subsidiary DHMAG supplied the Reich with punch, card machines, data sorters, and tabulating systems. These weren't just office gadgets, they were powerful tools for tracking populations, production, and logistics. The Nazi government used them to manage census data, identify ethnic groups, and organize the vast bureaucracy of occupation and extermination. The infamous German population census of 1939, which helped identify Jewish citizens across the country, was processed using DHOMAG equipment. Each punch card was a small, silent record of human life coded, categorized, and stored. With every hole punched, IBM machines transformed individuals into numbers, trains were scheduled, factory output tracked, and human beings classified as useful or disposable. It was a chilling fusion of modern efficiency and totalitarian control. Watson himself received a medal from the Nazi government in 1937, the Merit Cross of the German Eagle, for his contributions to international trade. He returned it in 1940 after public backlash, but by then, the business ties were firmly in place. DHOMAG's profits continued to flow, and the machines kept running throughout the war. After 1945, IBM claimed that its German subsidiary had operated independently during the conflict, much like Ford and GM had insisted about theirs. Yet, post-war investigations found correspondence suggesting that IBM executives in New York had been aware of the subsidiary's operations. Spare parts for the machines were even shipped through neutral countries to keep them functioning in occupied Europe. The moral implications were staggering. IBM technology, born in the optimistic world of American progress, had been repurposed into an instrument of control and extermination. While the Allies fought to liberate Europe, the Nazi regime was using American-designed machines to make mass murder more efficient. Both Standard Oil and IBM demonstrated a disturbing truth about the industrial age that technology and innovation, no matter how advanced, are never neutral. In the wrong hands, the same systems that build civilizations can also destroy them. When the war finally ended, both companies faced scrutiny, but little real punishment. In the atmosphere of post-war reconstruction and the looming Cold War, the focus shifted toward rebuilding Europe, not exposing corporate complicity. Standard Oil re-emerged as a dominant force in global energy. IBM became the face of the new digital age. Their wartime histories faded quietly into the background, hidden beneath the triumph of progress, yet the evidence remained. The patents, the contracts, the financial ledgers, all testifying to a time when the world's most respected corporations treated global war as just another business opportunity. They had proven one thing beyond doubt, that in the great machinery of war, money flows faster than blood. As the war expanded across continents, America's industrial presence could be felt in the unlikeliest corners of Nazi-occupied Europe. Factories bearing familiar names continued to hum with production. Corporations that had built their reputations on communication, photography, and soft drinks found themselves serving a very different master. One of the most astonishing examples was the International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, ITT. Today known for communications and technology, ITT influence in the 1930s stretched from telephones to aircraft components. Its subsidiaries spanned the globe, including deep roots in Germany through a company called Focke-Wulf, the manufacturer of some of the Luftwaffe's most feared fighter planes. Before the war, ITT had invested heavily in Focke-Wulf, and when Hitler's rearmament began, that investment paid off not for democracy, but for dictatorship. ITT-owned factories helped develop communication systems and aircraft technology that the Nazi Air Force would rely on. Even more astonishingly, after America entered the war in 1941, ITT continued to profit indirectly through its European branches and neutral intermediaries. The same technology that allowed the Allies to coordinate bombings and communications was simultaneously helping Germany defend its skies. Corporate records later revealed that ITT received compensation from both sides after the war from the U.S. government for property damage caused by Allied bombings in Germany, and from post-war settlements acknowledging its pre-war investments in Nazi industries. It was as if ITT had been rewarded for arming both armies. But ITT was not alone. In Rochester, New York, the Eastman Kodak Company built its global empire on the promise of capturing life's moments. But in Nazi Germany, Kodak's subsidiaries were busy developing images of war. German Kodak branches operated throughout the conflict, producing photographic supplies, film, and chemicals used by the military. These products were essential not only for propaganda and documentation, but for reconnaissance and intelligence, the silent eye of war. Kodak's German operations remained active long after communication between Rochester and Berlin supposedly ended. Through neutral channels, shipments of photographic materials continued to move between Europe and South America, keeping the supply chain alive. Kodak officials would later claim that their German offices acted independently, cut off from the American parent company. But German war photographers used Kodak cameras. Nazi officers carried Kodak film. Even the Luftwaffe relied on Kodak's optical technology for aerial mapping. While millions of innocent people disappeared into the chaos of the war, Kodak's images captured every triumph of the Reich, the marches, the rallies, the invasions, immortalizing moments of destruction with American-made precision. And then there was Coca-Cola, perhaps the most ironic name on the list. By the late 1930s, Coca-Cola had become a symbol of American prosperity and joy. Its factories in Germany were thriving, quenching the thirst of millions, including Nazi soldiers. But when the United States entered the war and trade between the two nations was cut off, Coca-Cola's German bottling operations faced a crisis. They could no longer import the syrup concentrate needed to make their flagship drink. Yet the business did not stop. In a move that would later become infamous, Coca-Cola's German division, led by Max Keith, created a new beverage, one that could be made entirely from local ingredients. That drink was Fanta. Born in wartime scarcity, Fanta was a product of necessity, a mixture of fruit byproducts and whey. But it quickly became a sensation in Germany, especially among soldiers and civilians deprived of luxury goods. While American troops drank Coke on the front lines, German families sipped Fanta at home, both under the same brand, both carrying the same origins. When the war ended, Coca-Cola welcomed its German managers back with open arms, celebrating their ingenuity for keeping the brand alive during difficult times. There was no condemnation, no inquiry, just applause for their creativity. Few in post-war America realized that Fanta had been born under the swastika. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. From oil and steel to cameras and soda, American corporations had threaded their influence through every layer of wartime industry. They had supplied the tools, the technology, and sometimes the very spirit of the enemy, all while continuing to prosper at home. But these connections were more than mere business deals. They revealed an unsettling truth about power, that ideology could be flexible when profit was at stake, and that the machinery of capitalism was indifferent to flags, borders, and moral lines. For many executives, war wasn't a tragedy, it was an opportunity. As the bombs fell over Europe and millions lost their lives, balance sheets in New York and London continued to rise. Profits were calculated, dividends distributed, and shareholders remained satisfied. The world was divided between good and evil, but corporations had discovered a way to serve both. Behind every tank, every camera, every radio transmission, a faint American fingerprint remained. As the guns thundered across Europe and cities turned to ash, another battle unfolded in the quiet corridors of power, one fought not with bullets or bombs, but with banknotes, ledgers, and discreet telegrams. Behind the chaos of the battlefield, the world's financial elite were playing a very different game. In New York, London, and Zurich, The skyscrapers of global finance glowed with activity. Money, as always, refused to take sides, and at the heart of this network stood some of the most respected names in American banking men who would later be remembered as the architects of modern capitalism, yet whose wartime dealings painted a far more shadowed picture. One of the central players was the Bank for International Settlements, founded in 1930. Officially, it was meant to manage World War I reparations and promote financial cooperation between nations. Unofficially, it became a crossroads where Allied and Axis funds quietly met a neutral bridge where even during war, business could continue. Through this bank, gold looted by the Nazis from occupied Europe, from the vaults of national banks, and even from the teeth of concentration camp victims, was funneled into accounts that reached across Switzerland and into the hands of international investors. American and British representatives on the board knew what was happening, and yet the transactions continued. The Chase National Bank, today known as J.P. Morgan Chase, and the National City Bank of New York, now Citibank, both maintained close ties to German institutions before and during the war. In the years leading up to 1939, these banks helped manage German assets, facilitated loans, and even handled foreign exchange for the Reich's financial system. When war broke out, their Paris branches operated under Nazi occupation, continuing to process payments for German officials. While Allied soldiers fought and died in France, Chase's Paris office quietly reopened under German supervision. Correspondence later revealed that executives in New York had authorized this move to protect company interests. The language was cold, calculated, and devoid of any moral compass. Meanwhile, the Union Banking Corporation in New York became a focal point of controversy. Officially, it was an American company, but its ties led directly to a powerful German industrial family, the Thyssen's, whose steel empire formed the backbone of the Nazi war machine. Among the bank's directors was a man who would one day become President of the United States, Prescott Bush, the grandfather of George W. Bush. Documents declassified decades later revealed that Union Banking had helped manage and transfer funds for German industrial interests well into the early years of the war. In 1942, under the Trading with the Enemy Act, the U.S. government seized the bank's assets, but no criminal charges were ever filed. The matter quietly disappeared, buried under layers of bureaucracy and post-war politics. Wall Street's involvement went even deeper. Investment houses like Brown Brothers, Harriman and Dillon, Reed and Co. had handled financial transactions for corporations with ties to Nazi Germany, helping them expand globally before the war. Their executives were not ideologues, they were pragmatists, believers in profit above principle. To them, the rising Nazi state was not a threat, but an emerging market. The story was the same across the Atlantic. In London, financial firms with American connections quietly arranged insurance, credit, and currency exchanges through neutral intermediaries in Switzerland, Portugal, and Sweden. Even as the bombs fell on British cities, a complex financial ballet kept spinning, transferring assets, securing profits, and ensuring that the world's wealthiest institutions would emerge from the war stronger than ever. Gold, more than any currency, became the silent witness of this hypocrisy. The Reichsbank, Nazi Germany's central bank, deposited stolen gold in Swiss vaults, where it was refined and exchanged for foreign currency. Some of that gold had once belonged to occupied nations. Some had been taken from Jewish victims. Once melted and stamped with new serial numbers, it became untraceable. The Swiss National Bank and private institutions like UBS and Credit Suisse handled these trades, and on the other end, American and British investors received payments in perfectly clean funds. The flow of wealth was relentless, unstoppable, and shrouded in secrecy. Money from death camps was turned into gold bars turned into dollars turned into power. When the war ended, the world celebrated victory over fascism, but in the tall glass towers of Wall Street and the discreet offices of Swiss bankers, there was no need for celebration. They had never lost. The financial system had survived untouched, its reputation intact, its profits secured. In 1946, at the Nuremberg trials, generals and ministers were held accountable. But the bankers and financiers who had enabled the Nazi war economy largely walked free. Some even helped design the post-war order, guiding the reconstruction of Europe through the Marshall Plan and the birth of the new global economy. The same hands that once financed destruction now financed rebirth. The same banks that held Nazi accounts now funded the rebuilding of democratic governments. It was a perfect cycle, profitable in war and even more profitable in peace. This was the real victory of capitalism, quiet, invisible, eternal. But behind the polished facades and patriotic speeches, a question lingered, one that could never quite be silenced. How many fortunes were built on the suffering of millions? How many legacies of success were written in the blood of the innocent? The war had ended, but for the corporations and bankers who funded both sides, it was never really about ideology or even survival. It had always been about business, and in business the only rule that mattered was winning. When the war ended in 1945, the ruins of Europe told a story of unimaginable destruction, cities reduced to dust, nations divided, and tens of millions dead. But while the world struggled to come to terms with the horror, another story unfolded quietly behind closed doors, the story of how the corporations that had fueled both sides of the conflict escaped justice and returned, stronger than ever, to dominate the new world that emerged from the ashes. In the early months after Germany's surrender, Allied investigators uncovered mountains of documents, contracts, bank records, trade correspondence, all showing clear links between American corporations and Nazi enterprises. Names like Ford, General Motors, Standard Oil, IT, and IBM appeared again and again in the files of the Reich ministries. Many of these companies had earned profits not only before the war but during it, through subsidiaries that operated deep inside the Nazi economy. The evidence was overwhelming. Yet, as the Nuremberg trials began, the focus was not on corporations, but on individuals, generals, politicians, propagandists, and bureaucrats. The men who had ordered the killing were put on trial. The men who had funded it were not. Behind this selective justice lay a political reality. The war had given birth to a new conflict, the Cold War. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence across Eastern Europe, and the United States needed a strong, stable Germany to stand as a bulwark against communism. That meant rebuilding German industry, not dismantling it. In 1947, American occupation authorities quietly ended efforts to prosecute industrialists from companies like IG Farben, Krupp, and Siemens. Many who had been convicted received lenient sentences, and some were released within a few years. Even the executives who had supplied slave labor to concentration camps found themselves back in boardrooms by the 1950s. IG Farben, the chemical empire that had once worked hand in hand with Standard Oil and manufactured the gas used in Auschwitz, was broken up into smaller firms, but those firms, including Bayer and BASF, quickly became corporate giants once again. Their leaders claimed ignorance, insisting they had simply followed orders. And the world, eager to move forward, believed them. In the United States, the investigations into wartime collaboration met a similar fate. The Department of Justice had files detailing pre-war business deals with the Nazi regime, but few reached the courtroom. Powerful lobbying, political influence, and the fear of economic instability buried the truth under red tape. By the early 1950s, most corporate leaders implicated in wartime profiteering were not only free but thriving. Standard Oil returned to its dominant position in global energy. IBM became the face of the computing revolution. Ford and General Motors helped rebuild the automotive markets of both Germany and Japan. ITT expanded into telecommunications across Europe. The same corporations that had once served the Reich were now pillars of the free world. It was a masterstroke of public reinvention. The press celebrated their contributions to the new prosperity. Politicians praised them for their patriotism and innovation. The public, weary of war, embraced the illusion of a clean slate. Few remembered the names of those who had sat across tables in Berlin, signing contracts that had once armed the enemy. Yet, not everyone forgot. In 1946, a few journalists and investigators tried to publish reports about corporate collaboration. One such expose, titled Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, attempted to document the financial ties between American financiers and the Nazi regime. It was largely ignored at the time, dismissed as conspiracy or communist propaganda. But decades later, declassified archives would confirm much of what those early researchers had claimed. Among those documents were memos from executives admitting that trade with Germany had continued through neutral nations even after 1941, that parts, technology, and funds had been routed through Switzerland, Spain, and Sweden under coded company names. The corporate web had been far more intricate and far more deliberate than the world had realized. Meanwhile, Washington itself had grown dependent on these same corporations. The war had proven the power of industrial mobilization, and in peacetime, that power became the foundation of America's economic and military dominance. The government poured money into defense contracts, infrastructure, and technology. The companies that had once profited from war now became partners in building the Cold War arsenal. The moral reckoning that might have followed never came. The narrative was rewritten. Instead of profiteers, they became patriots. Instead of collaborators, they were visionaries. History moved on, but the shadows remained. In the decades that followed, those corporations grew into the global conglomerates we know today. Their logos became symbols of progress, their executives champions of innovation. Yet buried deep within their archives lies the truth, the story of how modern capitalism was forged, not just in factories of productivity, but in the furnaces of war. The world rebuilt itself, but its foundation was stained. Every skyscraper that rose after 1945, every booming post-war economy, carried with it the invisible legacy of those who had chosen profit over principle. And though governments and media moved on, the patterns set during the war would repeat again and again in the decades to come in conflicts across Asia, the Middle East, and beyond, where corporations supplied both sides, profited from destruction, and then rebuilt what they had helped destroy. The great secret of World War II wasn't just who fought it, but who financed it. And the truth, as history shows, is that while nations go to war for power and ideology, corporations go to war for business. The Second World War had ended, but its industries never really stopped. They simply changed their uniforms. What began as the factories of fascism soon became the engines of the new global order, the Cold War. In 1946, President Truman announced what he called the Age of Security. The enemy was no longer Germany, it was the Soviet Union. Yet the means of confrontation would not be ideology alone, it would be technology, production, and power. The same American corporations that had once supplied Europe's dictators now supplied the arsenal of democracy once again, this time in the name of containment. The transformation was swift. Standard Oil, which had refined synthetic fuels for the Nazis, became a crucial energy partner in the rebuilding of Western Europe. The Marshall Plan, while presented as a humanitarian effort, also ensured that American corporations would dominate post-war markets. The oil pipelines of the Middle East, the refineries of Italy, the shipping lanes of Greece all were drawn into the orbit of U.S. corporate power. The profits of war were replaced by the profits of reconstruction. IBM, whose punch card systems once organized the Reich's bureaucracy, now supplied computers to the U.S. military, intelligence agencies, and the Pentagon. Its data systems formed the backbone of early Cold War surveillance and nuclear command operations. The very machines that had once categorized victims were now tracking missiles, spy satellites, and global communications. Technology had changed its purpose, but not its dependence on secrecy and control. Ford and General Motors reopened their European plants, producing vehicles for NATO and civilian markets alike. Their wartime experience in mass production of tanks and trucks had made them indispensable to the logistics of peace. Within a decade, Germany was once again a manufacturing powerhouse thanks in no small part to American capital, expertise, and corporate networks that had survived the war untouched. It, once linked to Nazi aircraft and communications systems, became a silent partner in Cold War intelligence. Its infrastructure connected embassies, air bases, and secret installations around the world. Few remembered its wartime past. Fewer cared. What mattered now was its usefulness. The banking houses of Wall Street, Chase, Citibank, Brown Brothers, Harriman all rebounded with unprecedented influence. Their post-war strategy was clear: fund the rise of global capitalism and contain the spread of communism. Billions flowed through their accounts into rebuilding Western Europe, Japan, and later South Korea. Yet even as they financed democracy abroad, they also maintained discreet relationships with authoritarian regimes friendly to American business interests. The lessons of the 1930s had not been forgotten, only refined. In 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, himself a military man, warned the American people about what he called the military-industrial complex. It was a phrase that would echo for generations: the unholy alliance between corporations, the armed forces, and government power. Eisenhower had seen firsthand how industry and war had become inseparable. Factories no longer waited for conflict. They prepared for it, sustained by defense contracts that guaranteed eternal production. By the 1970s, the blueprint drawn in the 1930s had become the architecture of modern power. Defense contractors, energy conglomerates, and technology giants operated not as national enterprises, but as global empires. Their loyalty was to shareholders, not borders. Wars became markets, and peace became a pause between profits. The irony was haunting. The same corporate patterns that had fueled Hitler's war machine secret partnerships, offshore accounts, and amoral pragmatism now thrived under the banner of freedom and capitalism. The ideologies had changed, but the machinery of influence remained the same. Intelligence agencies like the CIA forged close alliances with private corporations, using them as fronts for covert operations. Oil companies negotiated directly with monarchs and dictators, shaping foreign policy as much as diplomats. And American industrialists, some of whom had quietly traded with the Nazis, became the champions of the free world, their pasts erased by time and money. The Cold War was fought not only with spies and soldiers, but with contracts, patents, and financial leverage. The lines between government and corporation blurred until they were almost indistinguishable. Every missile built, every computer coded, every satellite launched was a continuation of the same story, the story that had begun long before 1939, when American industry first realized that war was the most profitable business of all. And as the decades passed, the secrecy deepened. The classified archives of wartime collaboration were sealed. The corporate records were sanitized or destroyed. Those who knew too much faded into obscurity. Official history spoke of heroes and freedom, but beneath the surface lay a quiet empire of money, untouched by defeat, unburdened by guilt. The Third Reich had fallen. Fascism had been defeated. But the system that empowered it, the global alliance of industry and power, had survived. In the New World, flags changed, leaders changed, enemies changed, but the corporations remained. Their legacy, built in the factories of the 1930s and sanctified in the markets of the Cold War, continues to shape the modern age. The same flow of oil, the same control of data, the same invisible alliances still determine the fate of nations. The war that ended in 1945 never truly ended, it simply evolved. When the guns of World War II fell silent, the victors gathered to divide the spoils, not only territory, but influence, technology, and industry. On the surface, the world entered an era of peace. But beneath that illusion, a new war was already being built, one not fought with tanks and soldiers, but with banks, corporations, and intelligence agencies. The foundations of this new order were laid by the same men who had helped shape the economic machinery of the war. At its center stood a triangle of power that would define the second half of the 20th century: the CIA, Wall Street, and America's largest corporations. After 1945, the United States faced a monumental challenge. The Soviet Union had emerged as its ideological rival, and Europe was in ruins. The Marshall Plan was introduced to rebuild Western economies, but behind its noble intent lay another purpose: to ensure that those economies remained dependent on American capital, technology, and military protection. To manage this new empire, Washington needed not just diplomats, but financial architects, men who could merge political strategy with economic dominance, and many of them came from Wall Street. The Dulles brothers, Allen and John Foster Dulles, were among the most influential. Before the war, both had worked as lawyers for Sullivan and Cromwell, a New York firm that represented some of the largest corporations in the world, including Standard Oil, and IG Farben's American interests. After the war, John Foster became Secretary of State. Allen became Director of the CIA. Together, they wove a hidden alliance between corporate America and U.S. intelligence. The CIA's first major covert operations were not just political, they were economic. When Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized his country's oil in 1951, threatening the profits of British Petroleum and indirectly Standard Oil, the CIA orchestrated a coup to remove him. The operation was funded and supported by oil companies, ensuring Western control of Iran's resources for decades. 2 years later, in 1954, another CIA operation overthrew the government of Guatemala, this time to protect the interests of the United Fruit Company, a powerful American corporation with deep political ties in Washington. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a growing pattern, a network where American corporations and intelligence agencies acted as one. The CIA provided the secrecy, corporations provided the cover and funding. Together, they created what President Dwight D. Eisenhower would later warn about in his farewell address: the military-industrial complex. But even Eisenhower couldn't have imagined how vast that complex would become. The Second World War had transformed American industry into a machine of unimaginable scale. By 1950, companies like Lockheed, Boeing, General Electric, and General Motors were no longer just manufacturers, they were extensions of the Pentagon itself. The Cold War guaranteed endless demand: missiles, bombers, nuclear submarines, and electronics. Each new threat meant new contracts, and with them, new profits. Behind it all, Wall Street financed the expansion. ensuring that the same elite families and banks who had once funded European rearmament now owned the backbone of America's global dominance. Chase Manhattan, Morgan Guaranty, and Rockefeller interests stood at the center of this financial web. And at its edges quietly, discreetly, were the remnants of those same European conglomerates that had once worked with Nazi Germany: Bayer, Siemens, Bosch, Volkswagen, rebuilt with Marshall Plan aid and quickly reintegrated into Western trade. Their former crimes were forgotten, their executives rehabilitated, their companies now essential partners in NATO's new economic alliance. The post-war propaganda machine painted the Cold War as a struggle between freedom and tyranny, democracy and dictatorship. But in the shadows, it was something else. A battle for control over the global economy, a system carefully maintained by the very corporations that had once profited from war itself. The CIA covert activities often blurred the lines between national interest and private profit. Front companies were established in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East to funnel funds, arm friendly regimes, and manipulate markets. Many of these shell companies were backed by major American banks. Meanwhile, corporations provided perfect cover for espionage. ITT overseas branches doubled as CIA outposts. Oil firms supplied intelligence from the Persian Gulf. Even journalists and academics were recruited to gather information under the guise of civilian work. By the 1960s, the fusion was complete. Corporate power, military strategy, and intelligence were no longer separate entities. They had become a single organism, a system designed not merely to defend the United States, but to perpetuate its dominance and the dominance of those who profited from it. And at the heart of that dominance was a philosophy born from the very system that had once driven Nazi Germany's industrial engine. That war, whether hot or cold, is the ultimate business opportunity. Every missile built, every coup funded, every proxy war waged, they were not just acts of strategy, but acts of commerce. And the profits flowed predictably from the battlefield to the boardroom, from the CIA black budgets to Wall Street portfolios. By the time the Vietnam War escalated in the 1960s, the United States had built an industrial network so vast that it could not afford peace. War had become the economy itself. And those who once sold steel to the Third Reich now sold weapons to both sides of the Cold War through subsidiaries, through alliances, through trade disguised as aid. The ghosts of the 1930s corporations still lingered, reshaped but unrepentant. They had survived defeat. Now they were thriving, protected by secrecy, fueled by ideology, and justified by fear. The American dream had merged with the machinery of empire, and beneath its surface, the same question remained: when profit depends on conflict, can peace ever truly exist?